Thank you for joining us for another DIAG conversation. I'm Ellie, co-director of DIAG, Democrats for an Informed Approach to Gender. DIAG is a 501c3 nonprofit organization of lifelong Democratic voters working to depoliticize and shed light on the ideologically driven medical scandal and associated harms that have resulted from the adoption of gender ideology and sex denialism. We're building a movement to shift the prevailing narrative around the experimental, dangerous medical practices that comprise sex trait modification, euphemistically known as gender affirming care, and to clear the path for a safer, saner, evidence based response to gender distress. Please visit our website at diag.org. That's di-ag.org. Please also check out our merch store. And if you'd like to help us continue and expand the work we're doing, please hit the donate button. DIAG believes in the liberal value of free speech and open discussion, which is part of why we host these spaces, to invite conversation on topics that have been left out of the public discourse. The opinions expressed by our guests are not necessarily the opinions of our organization. If you go on our website, you'll see the line biology, not ideology. And this is exactly the topic of today's discussion with our very distinguished guest, evolutionary biologist, Dr. Jerry Coyne. Dr. Coyne is professor emeritus at the University of Chicago in the Department of Ecology and Evolution. His scientific work is on the genetics of species formation. Aside from 125 scientific papers, a scholarly book on his research topic, and over 180 articles and book reviews in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Slate, and The Nation, Jerry is also the author of Why Evolution is True and Faith versus Fact, Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible. He currently writes the blog, also called Why Evolution is True, which has 30,000 subscribers and discusses not only the latest research in evolutionary biology, but also a variety of unrelated issues, including philosophy, politics, music, food, and cats. I highly recommend subscribing at whyevolutionIstrue.com. There's an ongoing push battled by biologists like Jerry Coyne, by religious fundamentalists who want creationism and intelligent design to have equal time with evolution in school science classes. But Professor Coyne may be facing a more formidable political adversary, the gender ideologues who reject the sex binary. Gender ideology has infiltrated the most unexpected quarters, including the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Society for the Study of Evolution, and science departments at leading university. Welcome, Professor Coyne.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Good.
Glad you made it on.
Yep.
I want to start with the incident from a couple months ago now. And among the curtailed list of accomplishments I noted in my intro, in 2011, you were awarded the Emperor Has No Clothes Award by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. That's FFRF. But at the end of December, you resigned from the foundation's honorary board. The foundation had published a piece by a trans rights activist titled, "What is a Woman?" You wrote a rebuttal, which the foundation took down soon after posting it, leading to your resignation. Your article was subsequently published in a few places, including Reality's Last Stand, that's Colin Wright's Substack. And then yesterday we posted a link to both your article and the FFRF article if anybody wants to read them. So, Jerry, first tell us a little about the Freedom from Religion Foundation and why you think it published that piece by lawyer Kat Grant. I mean, as you mentioned at the end of your article, it doesn't seem obviously relevant to the foundation's mission.
Well, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which I used to admire greatly and work for, is probably America's premier organization dedicated to keeping church and state separate. So it's a First Amendment organization, and they have a big legal team. They do a lot of things like warning colleges or police departments or schools not to put up biblical statements in their classrooms, not to mix religion and science, not to pray on public and school time, and this is what they did. And wholly approve of that because I'm a First Amendment absolutist. And I wrote on their behalf and praised them quite a bit. And eventually they named me to their honorary board of directors, which is a group of about 15 people, including Richard Dawkins and Steve Pinker, who whose mission wasn't really set out directly, but being on the board, I thought, well, I should do something every once in a while. And of course, that led to my downfall, as I'll describe in a minute, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, uh, and I don't want to spend too much time on this 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 issue, but
hmm
why do you think they published Cat Grant's article to begin with, since it is out of their purview?
Well, for a long time, the FFRF has been expanding its remit, not dealing strictly with church state issues. And one of them is trans issues or gender issues, which really don't have anything to do with church and state. I mean, there's not a strict divide between Democrats and Republicans in their views on, gender activism. So I'm not sure why they've done this. Maybe they were looking for new fields to conquer. But Cat Grant's article was one sign of this. Now, we had written to them before, and by we, I mean Richard and Steve and some other people, to avoid this kind of um, widening their remit because it would drive members away who were laser focused on the First Amendment. Whereas if you look at voters in America, most of them, I think 70 to 80% of them don't think, for example, that trans women, another word for that is trans identified men, why trans women should compete with biological women in sports. So that view of gender cuts across party lines. And the danger is if you start picking up this view, you're going to get in trouble with your members who don't agree with you. Those members are mostly liberal, I think, but they didn't react well to this. They're widening their ambit. I think they're becoming what we call progressive, and I don't use that as a laudatory adjective. Progressive Democrats, i.e., people on the extreme left of the Democratic Party. Examples of that would be Alexandria Ocasio Cortez or Bernie Sanders. And they're starting to become or move towards that end of the political spectrum. And I think Cat Grant's article, which is on what a woman is, was an example of this kind of movement.
Yeah, that article. So I'll just note for those who haven't seen it. So Cat Grant asserts that Americans see gender through the eyes of Christian European colonizers. That's, you know, kind of standard progressive speak now, and concludes with the line, "A woman is whoever she says she is." Your response to that, which you called biology not is not bigotry, was a straightforward explanation of the sex binary. So, did the Freedom from Religion Foundation tell you why it pulled your rebuttal, given that it seems, along their lines of what should be allowed, free speech?
No, I heard nothing from them actually, and I thought that was kind of rude. And when I went back to it and saw that it had disappeared, I wrote to them and said, my article's gone. What happened? Did it get lost? And I never got any reply and haven't gotten one to this day. What happened apparently was that some of the younger members, because it's always the younger ones that kind of push this ideology, and other members perhaps got upset by what I said. Not just that there are two sexes, but that this has implications for social policy, like trans women should not be allowed to compete against biological women in sports, and a woman undergoing rape counseling or in a battered women's shelter should not have to deal with a trans woman as their counselor. And that apparently offended them very deeply. That's the reason they give people a right to them, why they took my article down.
I noted that you also mentioned you included statistics that showed that trans identifying males in prison are much more likely to be sex offenders than other male inmates. And so I know that got pushed back. I'm wondering if you think that might also be the reason the foundation took down.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's true. As far as I can determine, this is indeed the case, but it's been twisted by people. I saw that this morning online to think that Jerry Coyne thinks that trans women are sexual predators, and that's
Yeah.
not my point. It's just for us that if they're imprisoned, trans women are more likely to be sexual predators than biological men.
Yeah. So we should also note that after your resignation from the Freedom from Religion Foundation's honorary board, two other prominent members resigned. Those are ones you mentioned: Richard
Yes.
Dawkins, the eminent evolutionary biologist, and psychologist Steven Pinker. Did you hear from any other members of the honorary board? I know the board seems to be gone completely now.
Well, they said they dissolved it, but I note that if you Google it, it's still up. So I don't know what's going on. I have not heard from any other members, and I did not contact any other members because I did not want to, you know, push them in a certain direction. They would have to make their own decision. And I didn't want to say, look, this is going on. Could you take my side? Steve and Richard are friends of mine, and I had discussed this letter with them before I sent it, and so they knew about it. And when they saw that it was taken down, they made the independent decision to resign. So that was three of us, and that was, like 20%, not 20%, like 10% of the honorary board, a little bit more than that. And that was a big hit for them. Sorry, I'll turn my mail off because it will make this sound. That was a big hit for them because Steve and Richard are the most well-known members of the honorary board. And I'm not sure why they took off the rest of them, other people who were honored by being put on this board, unless they thought that there would be more trouble coming down the pike if they let other people do what I did, or at least mouth off about gender activism. So, I have no idea what happened. I have not communicated with that organization since they took my letter down. I think that was an unconscionable act of censorship. They didn't have to publish it, but I sent it to the co-president, Annie Gaylor, to vet it by her. She made a few suggestions. I made a few changes, and then she put it up. And then she decided to take it down. And once you put something up, taking it down to me is unconscionable. That's different from a newspaper, rejecting a letter to the editor or putting it up and then deciding, oh, it's offensive, take it down. So, you know, that's why I was upset.
And so do you feel like this, you know, you've moved on and this is now behind you and there's a parting of ways and they'll go forward, or do you feel like there'll be further engagement to try and repair this breach of um, free speech?
Well, not with, I don't think I'm going to engage with this organization anymore. I'm off their board. I've resigned. But what's happened is that I've gotten thrown into this maelstrom of pushback against the sex binary. I had no idea that there were so many people that thought that there were more than two sexes in humans. And every day I have to deal with it in one way or another. Steve Novella, in his science podcast, which is quite popular, has said, sex is not binary. This is the common mantra of progressive liberals these days. It makes no sense. It's not biologically accurate. And it can only be attributed to the fact that because some people feel that they're not a man or a woman, that nature has to be that way. I call it the reverse naturalistic fallacy, that whatever you think is moral, that's what you have to find in nature. So, I'm free from the FFRF. I'm not free from the problem, which continues to dog me every day. I'm called a transphobe. I think somebody called me a far righter the other day, which, of course, I'm one of you guys. I've always voted Democrat. So, you know, there's no limit to the degree of um, opprobrium that can fall on your head when you engage in these things.
Yes, we're familiar with that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So let's keep talking about that. Um, let's move on to another pretty shocking instance of ideological capture in your field, which is this open letter from the presidents of the Society for, for the Study of Evolution, that's SSE, the American Society of Naturalists, and the Society of Systematic Biologists, to President Trump and objecting to his executive order that declared that there are only two sexes for purposes of law and policy. So these three signatories assert, and I'll quote them, scientific consensus defines sex in humans as a biological construct that relies on a combination of chromosomes, hormonal balances, and the resulting expression of gonads, external genitalia, and secondary sex characteristics. There is variation in all these biological attributes that make up sex. Accordingly, sex and gendered expression is not a binary trait. So, what's your reaction to their statement?
Well, it's wrong and it's embarrassing. I used to be president of the Society for the Study of Evolution. I would never have okayed any statement like that because it's wrong. I mean, there are two sexes in all animals and all plants. Sex is not a spectrum. You may maintain, and I haven't, you know, come down on this one way or the other because I'm still thinking about it, that gender is a spectrum, but not biological sex. Since the 1890s or even earlier, sex has been defined in animals and plants on the basis of the kind of gamete that they produce, whether it's a large immobile gamete, i.e., females, or a small mobile gamete, i.e., males. And that's true of every species. Note that that letter, which by the way hasn't been sent yet, as far as I can determine, and we've now upped the number of signatories to 125 instead of 23. That letter has not yet been sent to the president. It was also addressed to all members of Congress. It was clearly meant to be a sort of virtue signaling pushback against um, whatever Trump said, which is whatever Trump says has to be wrong in that view. And well, I think it's generally true. It's not always true. And their definition, the HHS definition of the sexes, which came out about 2 weeks ago, is absolutely on the mark. It comports with what biologists think the sexes really are. Note also that that letter says at the end that all species show this spectrum, not just humans. So we're not exceptional. Camels and sunflowers and lizards and fish, they're all on a spectrum of sex.
Well,
I mean,
yeah,
I don't. That's bizarre. It's completely wrong.
that explains my non-binary cat. Um, so, um, let me just get this straight. So they sent the letter to members, but not to the president.
Yes, they put the letter up on the website of these societies, and as far as I can tell, they haven't sent it yet. It was dated February. Sorry, it's March now. It was dated February 5th, so it's been almost a month. I think they were somewhat sandbagged by the degree of negative reaction they got, both from our letter, but also from many individuals who wrote to them and said this is crazy. Some people have even resigned from these societies. It's okay for societies to make political statements so long as those statements are within the ambit of the society's expertise. So the Evolution Society is perfectly capable of issuing a statement against creationism. And since sex is part of evolutionary biology, they could issue a statement about, how sex is defined by evolutionary biologists. Unfortunately, they issued the wrong definition. So, what they did in principle is okay, but in practice, it was dead wrong, embarrassing, and shameful.
And do you think, I mean, do you think that it represents a significant portion, maybe not the majority, but a significant portion of their membership?
I have no idea because they did not poll their membership, as far as I know. They say it's a consensus view or a majority view, and they have no idea. All I can say is that, well, they didn't ask their members if they agreed. But also, I've been an evolutionary biologist for 4 decades or more, and everybody I know subscribes to the Gamitic definition of sex. So I don't see any significant dissent. To check this, I pulled the textbook that I used to teach, which is written by Douglas Fatuma. It's called Evolution, off of my shelf, and looked up sex in the index. And sure enough, there it is, defined in black and white. Sex is defined by whether you have the reproductive apparatus to produce eggs or sperm. So, that's the going definition in the field. Now, sex can be defined in other ways by other people, but these other definitions are both minority definitions and they're not useful because they're not universal. The gamete definition is universal. There is no species that does not have two sexes. Sometimes they're combined in one individual, which we call a hermaphrodite. And in all animals, well, most animals, they're separate. So, if you define sex any other way, it's not universal. That's one reason we use this definition. The other reason is that it explains a lot about how evolution works. So, it's the universality and the utility of this kind of definition that has made it the one that's, I think, is the consensus view.
So so where does this leave members of these organizations? Because, once something like this has been put out there, everybody's in kind of this defensive position to say, well, you don't agree, but it's already been put out, it's already been established, and you're not in the primary position. I mean, is it all you have is to resign or write your own letters, I assume?
Yes.
Oh,
Well, I mean, if I were them, I would take it down. And I would also issue an apology, but they're not going to do that because you know how the progressives work. Never explain, never apologize, and so that's what they're doing. But they still have not sent this letter out, which makes me wonder if there's some behind the scenes kerfuffle going on that's motivated by some of the pushback they got.
yeah, hard to believe there isn't. Um, I just want to interject here. So Diag is no fan of President Trump, far from it. But we did welcome his executive orders on gender. And the order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government, that one seemed particularly precise in its language. Um, we obviously we do get pushback, and I'm sure you've experienced. I think you mentioned some backlash because of your viewpoints and because they align with those on the political and ideological right. So, tell us about the fallout. What has this done for you to you personally in terms of dealing with this?
Well, there's two items actually. There's that letter, the executive order that Trump issued. I don't know if you read the HHS letter, which clarifies and further refines the definition of
Yeah.
sex. But it's damn good, and it's damn good because I know some of the people who were biologists who gave feedback to the government, which was incorporated in that document. So I have no quarrel with it. The fact that I happen to agree with one of the executive orders, and especially with the HHS order. And of course, the head of the HHS is RFK Jr., who, if anything, is more odious than Trump. It makes it worse. But even so, I mean, people that you disagree with can do things that you agree with. That's the prime sort of motivating factor, I think, that's going to ever get Democrats back in power is to recognize that your opponents can be right. And we know this is true because it was a huge issue for swing voters, this gender thing, in the last election. It may not have swung the election towards Trump, but it didn't do the Democrats any good. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously. And so but in terms of your position and the people that you normally, interact with professionally, have you had problems there related to your support for this?
No, just some sort of stares that I interpret as not very friendly. I do write this on my website, which is widely read, and I'm sure that many people in my own department read it, and I'm sure that there are many people that don't agree with it because, I've received some pushback on bulletin boards and stuff. But I'm retired. What can they do to me?
Right.
So,
The ben-
so yeah.
so let's talk a little bit about Scientific American. So this is a publication that many science nerds, myself included, grew up reading. And in recent years, it's become a bastion of gender ideology. But you wrote that you'd hoped for better after the departure of the editor, Laura Helmuth. Apparently,
Right.
the journal is back to what you call progressive science. So, first, tell us what you mean by that, and then what do you think's happening there?
Well, I don't know what's happening there. I don't know. There's an interim editor. I don't know who he or she is. And I'm basing that conclusion, realize, on one issue, which had three woke articles in it. Two of them asserting that sex was non-binary, but a spectrum. I can't remember what the other was about, but they both surprised me because they're both ideological instead of scientific. So I'm worried that the magazine is going to go back to where it was under Helmuth. It wasn't just gender ideology that she was progressive, and again, I use the word progressive as a pejorative, that she was progressive about. It was everything. Um, calling people like Ed Wilson, one of our greatest biologists who died a couple of years ago, a racist with no real substantive. They even called Mendel a racist, and Mendel was a monk in Silesia. I doubt that he ever met anybody who wasn't white, and he certainly never wrote anything that was white. It's just a slur. And Scientific American was doing these things left and right, and it was clear that it was the editor's purview. And on election night, she had a meltdown, public meltdown on Twitter, in which she cursed everybody who voted for Trump and called them names that I don't even want to repeat here because they were too obscene. She used the F word and stuff, and soon after that, very soon, she parted ways with the magazine. I'm absolutely sure they told her resign or you'll get fired. But she was gone. The magazine's been going downhill for a long time. Um, I thought it was coming back because they published an article on the white crowned sparrow, which was a good scientific article published by a researcher who worked on this bird. Unfortunately, the bird has males and females, each of which comes in two forms, one with the white stripe in the head and one with the tan stripe. And the male with tan stripes will mate only with the female of white stripes and vice versa, which is what keeps the system sort of stable. But instead of saying, well, we have two sexes, each with two forms, she said, well, she implied that there are four sexes here. And that's not true. I mean, even in her own very own language, she refers to males and females. In other publications, the author has said that. So here we have a reputable scientific article publishing the kind of stuff that used to make Scientific American good, real popular science explained clearly. But she could not help twisting her article ideologically to imply that this makes hash of the sex binary, which it doesn't.
And this is
It's
the author writing that.
yes,
Oh,
yes, the scientist, the woman, I
yeah,
think she works at Emory University. I forgot her name, but she would, this used to be the métier
yeah.
of Scientific America, real scientists writing about their research in a comprehensible way. So I thought, great. And then I read the article and my heart sank. And there was another op-ed in the same issue by uh, another well-known activist that said that sex was not binary. It was a combination of various factors like hormones and genitals and all sorts of things, which is the downfall of all of these non-binary people. They say that sex is not based on gametes; it's a combination of whether you have different kinds of chromosomes or different genes or different hormones or whatever. And they say that, but they never tell us, okay, how do you determine what sex somebody is from this combination of traits? They can never answer that question. And that's because it's not a universal, the same way that the gametic definition is.
I mean, you hear this, and it's pretty hard to comprehend the breadth and the depth of the ideological capture of these institutions. And so I want to digress just for a moment from recent developments. From it seems like from time immemorial, humans have understood intuitively that there are two sexes. You know, Darwin didn't know about DNA, but he wrote about sexual selection in his origin on the origin of species. So
Yes.
when did biologists come to understand that an individual's sex is determined by the type of gamete their primary reproductive organs are organized through development to produce? And were there other theories of what defines sex? And were,
Well, there are other definitions. It all started with Anton Leeuwenhoek, of course, who invented the microscope, very famous scientist, and he was the first person to discover sperm. He actually put some of his own sperm under his rudimentary microscope, making care to ensure the reader that the sperm was obtained morally during conjugal relationships with this boy. But he found these little things swimming in the exudate, and that's when he realized that these things were probably had something to do with reproduction. The gametic definition of sex arose around the late part of the 19th century. I think the earliest one is like 1883 or something. But then you can trace the hardening and spread of this definition from that period up to the present time, and it hasn't really changed.
so were there competing theories recently? I mean, is this like a long-standing debate, or is this something that's just kind of
No,
blown up since gender ideology kind of?
it's blown up since. Well, we can discuss what has happened in society to cause this kind of fracas. But sorry, I forgot the question.
Just
Has this controversy been continuing? And the answer is not really, because the alternative definitions of sex don't make sense. I mean, if you look at Cat Grant's definition, she just basically raises one. Well, it kind of, you can define sex on whether you have a penis or a vagina. She's talking about humans, of course. Um, but it doesn't work, which is true. It doesn't work. It's not only does it not work well in humans, it works pretty well in humans. That's how most kids are sexed when they're born, but it doesn't work at all in fish or most birds that don't have penises or vaginas. You can define it on hormones, but that doesn't work very well either. Um, so these competing definitions, one by one, have fallen away as their utility and universality has been determined to be, ineffectual. And that's why the Gamete definition is still the one. And Richard Dawkins wrote a really good explanation of it on his Substack, which you can access for free. That's why that definition is the one that's still standing. So,
so
yeah, I mean, the people who oppose the sex binary, they never have an alternative definition. They never say that. They say that there's a million sexes and they're recognized by hormones and body hair and chromosomes and genitals and stuff, but they never tell you how to combine them to determine what sex an individual is. Nor do they tell us, okay, how many sexes are there then if there are just more than two? So, I mean, you think that they would offer an alternative if they're going to criticize a well-established biological principle.
well, this brings us to the wider topic of corruption and censorship of science by gender and, more broadly, maybe woke ideologues. So you and fellow biologist Luana Maroja spoke about this at a recent conference at uh, USC on censorship in the sciences. And the two of you also published an article on the subject in the Skeptical Inquirer. You wrote, scientists, both inside and outside the academy, were among the first to begin politically purging their fields by misrepresenting or even lying about inconvenient truths. Campaigns were launched to strip scientific jargon of words deemed offensive, to ensure that results that could harm people seen as oppressed were removed from research manuscripts, and to tilt the funding of science away from research and towards social reform. So, why do you think this happened? We like to think of scientists as being almost, you know, coldly objective in their pursuit of the truth. So, how did scientists, of all people, become so eager and early adopters of this ideology?
Well, there were early adopters, but of course, the earliest adopters were people in gender studies and other sort of soft sciences, what we call studies in the humanities. But so I thought scientists would hold out for a long time, but they didn't. They caved. I'm not sure why, but I think the reason they caved has to do with the reason why this kind of ideology has spread so quickly across academia. Um, and my explanation is postmodernism, which took over a lot of academia and installed two features into academia. The first being that there is no objective truth, and the second is that truth is really whatever is asserted by whoever has power. So there's this notion of self truth and this notion of the most powerful are the ones that get to determine what's true. Well, that also seeped into science, and I'm not sure why, but I think it's virtue signaling. George Floyd was killed. There was recognition, or the so-called racial reckoning, and an emphasis on victimology. And scientists are not immune to that. We're human like everybody else. So if I say, for example, that there are two sexes, and somebody calls me a transphobe or a misogynist because of that, yeah, it's gonna. I'm retired, but if I was still teaching, it would hurt me. People have been fired for this kind of stuff. Helen Joyce and other people in England are especially prone to that. So I think it's postmodernism, and in the case of gender ideology, combined with the fact that in the LGBTQ movement, the L's and the G's, the gays and lesbians, were eminently successful. They got their rights very quickly. And one of my colleagues today, we were discussing this, said, well, after this victory, people that are fired up to be activists, what are they going to do? They got to move on to the other letters of the alphabet. One of those is the T, trans people. So, you know, that was her interpretation of what happened. But regardless of which, scientists, we like to stay in our labs and do our science. We don't like to say, even though our science is much closer to humans than things like physics and chemistry and mathematics, we don't like to stick our heads above the parapets because of the danger of being called a racist, a bigot, a transphobe, a misogynist, and things like that. We're not immune to the feelings of being apostates in our own community.
So, for those of us kind of on the what you'd call probably gender critical side, we often try and engage in conversation with people who don't share our viewpoint, and those conversations are incredibly frustrating. They're just it is so difficult to have a reasonable conversation with people who have this other opinion that is kind of based in a belief system. Do you speak with colleagues who have this opposing viewpoint? Do you ever have those interactions?
Well, most of my colleagues share my viewpoints. So no, I don't argue with them about how many sexes there are. If I walked next door and told the bird guy that works there, how many sexes of Greenish warbler are there, he'll say two. And I'll say, well, what if I said there was like a million? He would just laugh at me. So, there are people like Steve Novella, who is a medical doctor, who will take the opposing viewpoint, and he can find his. We gave sort of opposing speeches at the CFI meetings in Las Vegas, and I haven't had a direct conversation with him. They offered me to debate him on their show. I can't remember the name of the podcast they have, but I'm not a very good debater, and I don't like the idea of scientific truth being determined by rhetoric. So I told them, no, I don't debate creationists, so I'm not going to debate this issue, but I'm happy to give my views in writing, and I'll be glad to read your views in writing. And that's the way it's going to be settled, I think, not through discussion. People that do this recognize, as you have, that discussion is completely useless. It's like trying to convince. It's harder, in fact, to to turn a gender ideologue into somebody that's reasonable, i.e., that admits that there's two sexes and that women have rights to have their own sports, than it is to convince a creationist that evolution is true. It's harder. And they won't give up. So I think the issue is going to die of its own weight, and I think it's doing so now. People are beginning to realize that a lot of gender ideology is just so far out that it's unreasonable and also unfair. And well, the NCAA just prohibited transgender people from competing with biological women. So that's a sign of progress, even though there are loopholes. And then we have the president's executive order. We have the polls of Americans showing that most of them think that, you know, definitions that violate women's rights are wrong. So, I'm heartened by this. I think it's going to go the way of creationism, which is it's going to be a niche view that it's not respectable to support in the future.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. That we have this push to, that seems ongoing. This push to be able to talk about intelligent design and creationism in schools, and I think there was recently um, a push to do this in maybe it was West Virginia, and between that fight and the gender battle, this does seem like a harder one because of the widespread acceptance of it, especially in our medical, our highest, you know, medical organizations like the AMA and the AAP. So you sound optimistic about where this is going to go, but between the two, this seems like a much harder battle when you have such
Oh,
wide
it is. It's much harder than creationism. And I just realized this as you were speaking, and it's because the young people are getting indoctrinated by, woke people. So this sex as a spectrum thing may be with us for longer than creationism. Well, creationism, has been with us for decades, sorry, ever since Darwin first attacked it in 1859. But the fact that the young people are taking over is problematic because it's the young people that tend to have the most woke and gender activist views. Kat Grant, who wrote that piece that I attacked for the FFRF, is young. And I think that the people who caused the fracas there that got my letter censored were also young. Um, and those people will be in power in the future. But even so, I mean, the palpable stupidity of saying that there are more than two sexes in human beings has got to count for something, you know. And that's why still, 70 to 80% of Americans, all Americans, oppose it.
well. So
So yeah, sorry.
yeah, you talk about that. So you have these ad- advocates of gender ideology, and they throw around all this science terminology and factoids that really cloud the discussion. Like they talk about clownfish and you know
Oh,
rare disorders of sex development, and they argue that these differences among species and exceptional cases in humans, that those are proof that sex is on the spectrum. And you've got kids learning this in high school. This is part of curriculum now in places. So what happens when these kids get to a university course and it's biology class and it's taught by someone like you? What's the scene there like?
well, I'm going to teach them what I see as true, which is that there are two sexes, and a clownfish changes from male to female when the alpha female dies, but it's only one sex at any one time, and there are only two sexes of clownfish, the males and the females. Yes, they can change because they change their gametes, but that doesn't mean that sex is a spectrum. There's only two kinds of gametes and two kinds of clownfish. This transition, by the way, takes place very quickly when the alpha female, clownfish have one female controlling a group of males, and if that alpha female dies, one of the males, and there's a premium on being the fastest male to change their sex, one of the males will, within a matter of couple of days, change into a female. But that doesn't mean that there's a spectrum of sexes in clownfish. you look at a clownfish, you're going to find two types, males and females, unless you happen to get them at the time when one of them is changing from one to another. I mean, that's just, it's easily dispelled to anybody that's rational. All these examples of sparrows where there's males and females that have two types. Um, there's males and females that have blue eyes and brown eyes, but we don't say that there's four sexes of humans because we have brown-eyed females, blue-eyed females, and the same with males. That's exactly the situation with, the sparrows. People their rational senses seem to have been overcome by ideology. Now, of course, this isn't new. This happened to the science in the Soviet Union in the 30s and 40s. In that case, it was more serious because people actually died because of the ideology. Here we just have stupidity rather than death. So, well, actually, they're. I mean, we're also having children being maimed because of gender affirming care and stuff. So I shouldn't be so, sanguine about that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely big problems. Um, so we talked about kind of the ideological capture, but I want to talk a little bit about the censorship issue. So, where are you seeing the censorship issue in the sciences most? Like, what other fields or areas of science are vulnerable to censorship now?
Well, every science has a form of censorship, but it's not of the kind where they take an article down. Although they have, for example, um, it's happened in physics. My colleague Anna Krylov, Krylov, has written extensively about it. She's a quantum physicist and a chemist. So, the kind of censorship that happens there is that articles that are deemed potentially harmful to people are treated very badly when they are in the literature. They aren't as accepted as for publication as often. There's a purging of language, for example, in other things like the word black hole has been attacked because it's deemed to be a slur on African Americans. I mean, that's insane. Brown bag lunches for the same reason are no longer acceptable. Um, but it's not so much overt censorship in which somebody says you cannot write that, you cannot publish that. It's a form of chilling of speech in which you know that if you say certain things, you're going to get in trouble. You're going to get a bad reputation. It might hurt your chances of getting a grant, of getting your paper accepted, of being able to teach. A woman in Maine was had her classes taken away from her in a college because she said there were two sexes. That's a form of chilling of speech. I mean, they didn't tell her you couldn't say that. They just took her class away from her. Well, that's tantamount to censorship. But if you look at the paper I wrote with Luana, the ideological corrosion of biology, you can see the various forms that censorship takes in biology. But there's also articles about it happening in physics and in chemistry and even in mathematics, which is beginning to be taught in a woke fashion now.
Yeah, it doesn't seem comprehensible. I mean, that these specialties could be affected when it seems so irrelevant. And I have seen where research has there's been this compelled DEI component, which is kind of an offshoot of this to me, where you have to have this DEI component. And so researchers just writing stuff in that's irrelevant to their research, but they're required to do it in order to get funding.
Yeah, that was has been done by the National Institutes of Health, which is the biggest biomedical funder of research in the world. Um, and it's been done by the National Science Foundation. But that was another one of the executive orders that Trump has um, promulgated that I think is in general, although not completely, good because DEI is responsible for this kind of divisiveness that keeps people at odds with one another. Um, I think DEI, for example, is largely responsible for propping up anti Semitism in American universities. Jews do not count, and I'm Jewish, by the way, or secular Jewish. Jews do not count as minorities, you know, even though they are probably the most beleaguered minority in the United States. And that comes from DEI, because DEI does not see Jewish people as victims, and therefore it's okay to treat them differently. Whereas Palestinians, who are more numerous, are considered to be victims. So yeah, I mean, I'd be happy if DEI was to go away and be replaced by this system which says we treat everybody equally and that everybody should have equal opportunities. That last part is harder because how do you give poor people equal opportunities when they're born into a depauperate, impoverished environment? Maybe they don't have a father, the schools are lousy. I mean, we have a long way to go to give equal opportunity to everybody, but you don't fix that by leapfrogging people on the basis of identity rather than merit over other people.
Um, I want to pull back a little bit to the fields that are affected, and I know there was issues around anthropology using specimens that that those specimens could not be studied because of issues around um, uh, DEI and the sciences. So that was another field that I saw where the effect of these ideologies was keeping the science from progressing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Elizabeth Weiss has written 2 books about that. Um, and she was an anthropologist at San Jose State who was forbidden to study the bones of Native Americans, which they had in a collection at her university, because that was deemed unseemly. And now it's gone further and further to the point where if any artifact or bone is found on public land, any tribe, and by tribe I mean Native American tribe or First Nations tribe, can say, this is probably ours because it's in a territory that we once inhabited. You scientists cannot study it. It doesn't have to be a bone, it can be a piece of pot or anything else that's deemed property of these people. That and so they reclaim it. And even in museums, specimens have been covered up because of this. And that, of course, keeps us from studying our past. I mean, I do think that perhaps tribes have claims on, artifacts and bones that were identifiably theirs, but it's usually not identifiably theirs. And the best way to do that is let the scientists study it first and then give it back to them. But right now, anthropology is being severely impeded, at least in terms of field work, by this kind of mentality. You know,
And what are we losing? I think some people would argue, well, that seems reasonable. It's disrespectful. So what do we lose when we aren't able to study those artifacts?
well, we lose the history of humanity. I mean, it's as simple as that. Those bones are useful. I mean, this is how we determine, for example, that a group of people died of Black Plague in Europe that were found in a well, I think, because they could do DNA sequencing of their bones. Now, if the system that obtains in the U.S. obtained in Germany, we wouldn't have been able to determine that. Also, the whole history of humanity now is being rewritten based on DNA that's taken from ancient bones, not just artifacts, but also from artifacts. So, the history of humanity depends on artifacts and bones and DNA. And that's how we know, for example, that humans left Africa um, 60,000 years ago and spread across the world and crossed the Bering Strait 20,000 years ago, spread into North and South America. If we didn't have those artifacts, we wouldn't know that. We would be deprived of precious knowledge about our own human history. Now you can say, well, so what? This doesn't make us richer or smarter or healthier to know that, but it's part of the intellectual advance of our species that we understand where we came from. I mean, I'm a pure scientist. I can't claim that my research has ever cured cancer, but it has helped us understand how species arise. And same thing with, black holes. I mean, if you're intellectually curious, and a lot of people are, you want to know this stuff.
The Along those lines, you know, I see that when we start to delve into untruths and we hold them up as science, there is broader fallout. I think people have lost faith. I know plenty of parents who really don't want to take their kids to the doctor because they're just immersed in the gender issue. They ask the kids what their pronouns are, when parents don't want their kids um, even dealing with this if they're not developmentally appropriate for the age of their kid. So, where do you see the broad impacts to not just the fields and the study, but to society when science gets corrupted like this?
Well, remember, it's both the right and the left that corrupt science. I mean, you guys and myself are on the left, and so we're particularly sensitive to our own side doing this. This is why I spend my time trying to correct the left rather than railing against Trump, which a million other people are doing instead, and I don't need to. I mean, I think Trump is odious and shameful, but other people can do the job on him better. But who's going after the left? Anyway, science is well, so, RFK Jr. is a sort of an anti-vaxxer. There's a measles epidemic in Texas now. What's going to happen? Measles can kill people. It's already killed one. That's the danger of medical um, treatment. And, there's all kinds of differences. And when you start treating people differently based on their identities, there's a claim, for example, that Black women who are pregnant, their babies have a higher chance of dying if white doctors take care of them. And that was used to impute racism to white doctors. They're simply not helping these Black women give birth. It turns out that Black women who have more problems with their pregnancy or during birth tend to go to white doctors more. And that's why the mortality rate is higher. And then that leads to, instead of, taking somebody to the appropriate doctor, you have to give them a race-specific doctor, and that can lead to their death. But as a scientist, I don't like to couch things so much in terms of practical outcomes so much. Although your group is dealing eminently with a practical outcome, which is taking kids who don't even understand what sex is, much less gender, and starting them on hormones when they're prepubescent, and then transitioning them through surgery or other hormones when they get past puberty. And that has a lot of palpable harms. I mean, I think it's up to a person to decide what sex they want to belong to after a certain age, either 18 or 21. I don't know how members of your group believe, but to do it to kids or to try to convince kids that they may be trapped in a body of the wrong sex, I think it's horrendous. Abigail Schreier's book was the first to call that out, and you know what happened to Abigail Schreier. So, right, she's come back again. So this again hardens me. She's been shown to be right with her rapid onset gender dysphoria and her view that there is social contagion that causes people to transition. Um, so that's some of the harms, the most obvious ones. But it's also in sort of understanding almost any area of human endeavor. If you are afraid to go into an area, then that's going to deprive you of the knowledge. I can barely think of any kind of research that I would say should not be done because there's so many unexpected benefits that come from research that seems trivial or irrelevant or things like that. So,
Well, that seems perfect place for us to start taking audience questions. I know we only committed to a, an hour of your time, so um, let's move on to questions. If people want to get um, uh, queued up, please stick to the topic at hand. Please make sure that you're asking a question, not making a comment, and And as always, no, we'll definitely cut you off if you're not civil. Also, if you're having trouble getting elevated to speaker, or it seems like we're not hearing you and you're not able to ask your question, please try logging out and then back in.
Progressive researchers complain that Trump's executive order leads to censorship of research. What do you think of that? So that question is from
Yes.
Just Name, I think is that person, or Just Me or something.
Okay, and I can answer that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, please. I can hear you loud and clear.
There's no doubt that it leads to censorship of
Yes,
research. For one thing, the
that's
kind
the
of
question.
research that is going to
Yep,
the kind
yep.
of research that is going
Oh,
to be funded is research that does not contain words like woke or gender or anything else like that. So there's certain areas of research that are now going to be off limits because they and this is mainly the left now who have banned that, not the right. But the left has also made certain areas of research untenable. For example, if you want to study the behavior of different human races, for example, which is an interesting question, and whether it's genetic, you're not allowed to do that. There's a whole database on race and various aspects of race held by the United States government and funded by you guys, us, the taxpayers. We are not allowed to access that because it's ideologically sensitive. Race is one of the hottest potatoes in science. So no, we can't study that. We can't study, you know, gender because of the right. Um, there's whole areas that have been chilled by both the right and the left. And plus, there's this immense cutting of science funding that comes from Trump and Elon Musk that's going to wipe out whole areas of endeavor.
Thank you so much. For our next question, Kara Dansky.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the space, and thanks, Dr. Coyne, for your presentation. So my name is Kara Dansky. I'm a former president of a radical feminist group, Women's Declaration International USA, which advances the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. And one of the things that radical
okay.
feminists care very much about is abortion rights. And I have heard a concern expressed that the definitions set out in the original order defending women from gender ideology could be construed to create what's called a personhood law, which could have effects on women's ability to obtain abortion. Now, I don't know anything about your politics on abortion, and I know your primary concern has to do with the accuracy of the definitions, and you don't want to politicize it. But if you could help me understand, do these women have a legitimate concern that the definitions set forth in the EO could be construed to create a personhood law?
I presume you're referring to the statement that the sex is determined at conception. Is that
Correct.
correct?
Yes.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean so that's just biological sex we're talking about here. Whereas abortion depends on personhood. So it doesn't say that personhood begins with conception. If it if that's what was intended, well then you got to blame the right for that. By the way, I'm a pro-choicer. I go further than most pro-choicers because I agree with Peter Singer that a child who's born and is going to die within a week of some horrible disease like anencephaly, those children should be euthanized. I've gotten in trouble for that. So, I believe in abortion pretty much all the way up to term and maybe after term sometimes. I think that the definition of sex that's given by the government in both the EO and the HHS letter, and you really have to read the HHS letter because that's the real revision of the definition that's useful. Um, has nothing to say about abortion. It just says when biological sex is determined, and it's determined by which sperm fertilizes the egg, X or Y, in general. And That doesn't say anything about the morality of abortion as far as I can see. So, personhood and biological sex are different, you know.
Yep. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks, everyone. I think Ellie is having some technical issues, so she's going to try to log out and then come back in. So right now, I think we had another person lined up to ask a question. Learned Mama.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for doing the space and the wonderful conversation and questions that you've all asked um, the speaker. But I I'm trying to think about how I can phrase this because if there are only two sexes and people cannot change their sex, why is it that the medical community would be allowed to practice a eugenics project on vulnerable people regardless of their age?
Sorry, a eugenics project?
Well, if they're providing opposite sex hormones and removing otherwise healthy body parts and causing iatrogenic harm to individuals, whether they're under 18 or over 18, because in my worldview, the most vulnerable population is probably the 18 to 30-year-olds at this point with the social contagion. Why should this be allowed in the medical community, which should adhere to scientific rigor, which is there are only two sexes?
Well, that remains true. First of all, I don't think that what you're describing is eugenics, which has to do with prevention of reproduction, although that is sort of involved here, but it's mostly having to do with killing people. This isn't the Holocaust. It's removal of body parts. I don't see a good argument for preventing people from having done anything that they want to themselves once they're of the age of consent. If you want your leg amputated, I mean, you're going to have to find a doctor willing to do it because you want to have two legs. I mean, sorry, one leg instead of two. Are you going to say no? Doctors can't be allowed to do that. I mean, I just can't agree with that. I do not think that. Well, and also there is such a thing, and I believe this to be true, of gender dysphoria, in which people feel that they are members of the wrong biological sex. And if they're the age of consent, I don't see why they shouldn't be allowed to alter their appearance to conform to that. As far as I know, and I may be wrong about this, the long term outcome for people of age who then transition seems to be pretty good. They seem to be, in general, happier with having to be able to transition. So I don't think I really agree with you that this should be banned.
Okay. Am I back in?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Yeah. X is interesting. Okay, I'm sorry to say that I was not on for that answer, but if anybody has comments about that, they should go ahead and queue up. I'm going to elevate next Patsy Mink and then Dill Scout to ask questions. So Patsy, go right ahead. Patsy, you should be able to speak now. Yep.
Hi. Thank you.
Hi.
I have a follow-up question about this. You say that anybody who wants to have a leg removed or remove organs should be allowed to do that. That it's just sort of a consumer ethics issue. It's not a societal issue. But my question is who is responsible for the medical bills of these people? This is a very expensive condition to maintain. The surgeries, the medications, the side effects from the medications. Um, People do become debilitated physically. Bone brittleness is one example. There are many others, and we don't have long-term studies for the outcomes of adults. We really don't. People go through these procedures that are not tracked, and we pay for it through our health insurance premiums and our Medicaid dollars. So it is our business. It's not, if somebody can sign on a dotted line that they are 100% responsible for paying out of pocket for their own medical care for these crazy procedures, well, then fine. I'm sort of interested in your feedback on that.
Well, I agree with you. Somebody that wants to have a leg removed first has to find a doctor that will do that, and you're going to be hard pressed to do that. Second of all, since it's not medically necessary, I don't think that any insurance program should be forced to pay for that, nor should the public. It should be, the burden of that should fall on the person that wants it done. Now, what about gender alterations? In general, unless the person is really, and this will really depend on psychologists or psychiatrists, if the person is in danger of dying if they don't transition, and I don't think that's very common at all. I think it's a threat that's made. Do you want a dead daughter or a living son, that kind of stuff. I don't, unless a person is going to die if they don't transition, then I think the burden for the medical bills should fall completely on them, and insurance shouldn't pay for it at all. So it has to be a medical necessity for us to even get involved in this. And I haven't really thought through the implications of transitioning. But as far as I know, people like Jan Morris, who were the early transitioners, she, by the way, always maintained that well, he he was a biological man, paid for themselves, but it could be the national health. I don't know. In Britain, I don't know how it works, but for unnecessary procedures, plastic surgery, things like that, I don't think that we should foot the bill.
But we'll end here. And I want to thank you for speaking with us today. Please do check out Dr. Coyne's blog, Why Evolution is True, which, besides being informative, is a lot of fun. I'd like to announce our next space, which will happen next Monday, March 10th. We'll be speaking with psychotherapist and author of the book Shame, Free Yourself, Find Joy, and Build True Self-Esteem about this exact topic and the intersection with boys and young men who have been captured by this ideology. I hope you can join us for that. If you haven't already done so, please join DIAG by clicking the join button at diag.org. Our power to reach our lawmakers is through our numbers. It's important to show that we are a silent majority who believe in classical liberal principles. Following the science, including on the reality of sex, ethical evidence-based medicine for all, the power of civil discourse and open dialogue, advocating for the rights of women and girls to sex-based spaces, honors, and opportunities, LGBT rights, and the necessity of a compassionate, reality-based society where truth matters. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.